Now that you're here, I might. All right, thanks. All right, thanks for coming this afternoon. I got the pleasure of having the session after lunch, so I'm sure most of you will nod halfway in, and I won't take offense. All right, so we're going to cover emerging trends and topics, and I'm a mover when I talk. I'm going to try to stay on this 1 foot circle, but if I fall, I suppose someone will have to come help me up. All right, so there's really two, I use the word era, but there's really two big movements afoot in IAM today, and the first one is sort of the consumerization of IAM, right? So the driving towards making business for employees and or more importantly for consumers more consumer friendly, and that means a whole host of things, and so we'll kind of cover each one of these briefly over some period of time today. The next is identity as a service, which kind of lives on the cusp of the consumerization era as well as inside the integration era. The next largest thing that's happening in identity today is the integration era. And what I mean by that is the identity vendors are all too often now finding themselves being asked to, by customers, integrate with things they haven't integrated with in the last 3 to 5 years. And so there are a ton of them to name, and so when I get to them in that portion of the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about each of those. But generally speaking, when we say emerging trends in IAM, we're really focused on things that our customers are asking us about, our customers are considering making investment in the next year to 2 years, or things that are troubling our customers that there may not be a set of great solutions for going forward today. Right? And so this is somewhat humorous, and I won't take credit for it. I stole it from one of the other identity management presentations I've seen in the last year. But it really tells the right story in that, every set of years, we feel like in the identity industry we're bleeding edge and cutting edge and doing cool things. But in reality, as we've progressed in IT, we've realized we're really not so cool. We're a few years behind. And now finally the business and the consumers of that business are screaming, hey, be more about me. How will you support me? And that's driving revenue-based decisions for those organizations. And so that's where we come up with this consumerization of IAM. And so let's talk for the next couple slides about consumer identity management in general, right? So the things to understand. Things outside of security are driving how you manage consumers going forward. Things like e-commerce, social networks, mobile applications, connected devices, things that we as IT security practitioners have ignored for a few years and or not wanted to adopt from a security perspective are now driving the identity conversations with regards to people who have big consumer populations. Consumer identity management is now really focused on improving relationships, improving business revenue, driving adoption, and not really focused on the lifecycle management events and or the security events. They're more focused on how do I help our business better enable them from a business perspective. There are people that have different perspectives on this next statement, and I'll get to that in a second. But in our world, starting sometime in the middle part of last year, we started to see this formal divide between my enterprise IAM program and my consumer-based identity initiatives. And I guess what I mean by that is, for the last 10 years, they've all been combined. Customers have made some investment in identity management internally, and then they've just either duplicated that same system and used it for external consumer-based identity management, or they've owned a separate system for that, or they've tried to use the same system and the same set of approaches. I'll put up a registration UI, I'll manage a user credential, I'll manage a password. If I have to do that 6 different times, I'll just do it 6 different times, but it's how we do identity management at X organization. So obviously talking to consumers, they're tired of that. They would rather do business with an organization that presents them with the ability to do it in a more streamlined manner. Talk to IT security, and even though there are security concerns with maybe this new technology or that new technology, they're recognizing we must do it in a secure way, but at the same time, we have to do it in a way that streamlines our ability to interact with our consumers. Marketing, I can't tell you 3 years ago if I had a single marketing person ever involved in identity management conversations. But now when I go to customers and I talk about consumer identity management, someone at the table is there representing marketing, and someone at the table is trying to represent how do we collect better data about our consumers, and how do we use that data to drive a better experience or interaction with those consumers. And then executives, depending on who you're talking to, they're trying to cost control and contain. They're trying to make sure that the business has the right reputation and brand going forward, that they're forward-leaning around interactions with consumers. And so everyone's perspective has really changed in the last 18 months to where we're now formally considering or now trying to advocate for you as an organization to handle the enterprise identity and consumer identities as really two distinct strategies going forward. So what are the influences outside of security, right? I mean, if we look at things that are also influencing the consumer identity management market, that there's 2.5 exabytes of data being created every day. And more than 90% of that social media data that's out there is unstructured. The fact that we try to have a very structured approach to identity data and identity management doesn't work for consumer identity management. The fact that I want to give you these 6 fields you must fill out in your registration form, and then I'm unwilling to allow you to only fill out 4, or I'm unwilling to allow you to give me 8. That dynamic is changing with regards to consumer-facing identity management. The last bullet there is probably one of the most important, right? That 89% of companies plan to compete primarily on the basis of the consumer experience by 2016. That was put out in a Gartner paper probably, I believe, the middle of last year. The idea that end user experience drives revenue, most of us are all employees of somewhere, and I don't think we were ever really consulted when our IT systems were rolled out to us. The idea that that's fundamentally changing for consumers in the organizations, I think, forces us in IT security, and more importantly, us in identity management, to handle the realities differently. And so what does that reality look like? And I don't know how that picture is going to come across. Let me come over here and just peek. That's not terrible. Is there an infrared on this? Thank you. Perfect. So the idea is that consumers want this simplistic way to work with you, much like you guys do as consumers in your own digital world, right? You want some simplified registration experience. You're obviously not going to mind if we collect data about you, as long as we use that data to target you in a better, more specific manner to you that enriches your experience with us. We hope to then drive you to some initial purchase. Then obviously we want to manage that relationship post-sale. And you can see how this words you're used to talking about, right? Login experience, single sign-on, federation, strong authentication, and self-service. Those are all identity terms that we're used to. It's these things up here that we're not usually using in our identity management vernacular with regards to consumers, right? But it's the consumers want this to be seamless and also be dynamic and varied with regards to approach. And so again, what we're finding is they're driving the conversation and not us. And who they are to us matters where they are in that experience, right? Whether they're visitors, whether they're prospects at our website, whether they're new customers to us, whether they're return customers to us, we're going to interact with them in a different manner, or need to interact with them in a different manner with a variety of mechanisms that way with regards to having not done that 2 or 3 years ago. We just gave them a front-end UI. We just told them to fill it out. We just told them, here's your user ID and credential, and then we gave them some password mechanism to reset it in case they lost it. Now the consumers are telling us, well, I want to use this, or I want to use that, or I want one-time password, or I want you to have this bit of data about me and not this bit of data about me. What's that doing for us, right? So where are our concerns outside of purely the security relative concerns from a vulnerability perspective? And they're in the areas of scale, repository, maintenance, support, operations, and privacy. And so I'll just talk to each one of those for a second, right? So scale, before we had choices, we just put up external consumer-facing or external consumer-held LDAP repositories. And so we may store, tens of thousands of consumers up to tens of millions of consumers. Those who are tipping into that tens of millions or even into the hundreds of thousands are finding that the idea of owning an LDAP and storing all of them in a single LDAP is becoming overwhelming just from a maintenance perspective. So understanding how that repository landscape is going to change, where should these consumers be stored so that you as a business can adopt to the idea of managing hundreds of thousands of users' data without having to personally manage it like you would another server or repository is something you have to consider. The maintenance of that data and who's going to maintain that data, meaning, is it the end user from self-service? Is it in some re-opt-in strategy where as they update things in their profiles of their social media sites, you're pulling back that data on a regular basis? Is it you guys having to have some maintenance of that life cycle? Is it outsourced entirely? Where does that live today? I mean, today, I could give you a handful of customers who, marketing manages their bit of data about customers. Some of it's managed in the CRM system. Some of it's managed in the authentication repositories. If they've registered with you for 5 or 6 different things, they likely have registered with you in 5 or 6 different repositories that you and IT are then managing as stovepipe repositories with the same consumers. If you're an organization, I won't make anybody raise hands. I mean, if you're a multimedia organization like Time Warner and you've grown through mergers and acquisitions, I mean, every one of those cable companies that you've bought or phone companies that you've bought have always had customer repositories, and you haven't on the back end likely consolidated all those into a single repository yet. So now your customers are in 4 or 5 different repositories, even though they're just a single-facing customer of Time Warner. Provider networks have the same problem. Banks that grow through mergers and acquisitions have the same problem. So how do we maintain all that data and support all that data? The operational aspects of having less and less control over device types and UIs, but greater demand for performance and also greater demand for mitigated vulnerabilities is a concern for us. If we have to be able to provide our data to or our service to consumers, but have no control over what endpoints they're using, what versions of UIs they're using, we have to find a way to mitigate those vulnerabilities internally. And then finally, privacy. Right, and this is sort of twofold. One, if you have a global consumer footprint, right, you obviously have to govern your privacy data differently depending on whose data you're collecting from what country. On the flip side of that, if you're outsourcing consumer identity management, like in the identity as a service world, which we're seeing more and more now, you have concerns or should have concerns around where that data is being stored. The service provider you're using and leveraging, where are they storing that data and how are they storing that data? And then complicating the strategy overall, right, is the use case around the employee also being a consumer or consumers as employees. And just to sort of help paint that picture a little better. Oops, sorry. If we look at the numbers of employees who own devices today and use them for work purposes at 77%, 69% of access of those employees access corporate data from personally owned smartphone or tablet, just like I do on my iPhone today. 66% of employees use their corporate laptops for consumer purposes. So we are starting to, we as employees and also as consumers, are starting to force the convergence of those two personas together. And so we also want our organizations to act like we're more like consumers than we are these rigid stovepiped employees being put in boxes. So it's driving not only the pure B2C relationship investments to be different, it's also how do I manage my employees as they are consumers of my services often as well. So that leads us to social media as the second piece of consumer identity. And so there's 2 pieces of social media's place in identity. First, we'll talk consumer to corporate, and then we'll talk corporate to consumer. There's key categories here to understand as well. There's like 3 overall pieces to social media when you talk about consumer to corporate. It's connect, collect, and convert. Right? So how do I connect to those users? So typically that's some sort of opt-in policy registration piece or point, allowing them to share data with me. How do I then collect that data and use it in a meaningful purpose? Where do I collect it? How do I store it? How do I access it and allow marketing to access it to make more targeted programs towards those consumers? Ultimately, with the same idea of how do I convert them from visitors into loyal repeat customers. That's the idea of why we want social media in our consumer identity marketplace. I think that first bullet's fairly obvious. I mean, I don't know too many websites that I go to nowadays where they have a consumer targeted focus who don't have some opt-in strategy, who don't allow me to sort of leverage some existing credential about myself and not force me through many registrations today. Everybody who provides, so like, all the folks that are up here, and the list could go on and on. but everybody who provides your identity on your behalf as an identity service provider has their own policies around how much data they'll share. Probably Facebook being the most forward-leaning around how much they'll share, and LinkedIn being like the laggard around how much they'll share or how they'll even federate with others to share. So I guess what I'm saying is it's fairly simplistic from a specifications perspective to build it on your own. But there are third-party service providers who, this isn't a sales pitch, so I won't necessarily give anyone credit for one thing or another, but there are a number of providers in the marketplace today that do this middleware interaction between consumers to you and you collecting that data and managing it on the back end. I would tell you, don't bother building this yourself, because as these folks change their policies, as these folks find themselves more and more becoming real identity providers where they may have to vet some level of identity or may have to be accountable for how much they share, they're going to make changes on their side. If you build it yourself, you have to be accountable for making all those changes in your custom connectors or federations with those service providers. Whereas, obviously, if you buy a third-party subscription or a third-party product, you're going to get those changes in your subscription.
Sorry, folks. I'm Geek here. We had a little bit of a glitch, but the audio and the live video should start working again at about the 17-minute, 20-second mark. Sorry for the inconvenience.
They started to do surveys with end users. They found that it was very frustrating that they had to register every time they wanted a salary calculator. If I come back for next year's calculator, I've got to register again. So on and so on and so on. And so they developed this life cycle where, if you just want to interact with us and get documentation from us, you can opt in once and never have to opt in again. And you can always download stuff from us as long as you're not doing things on our behalf or with us. If you apply for a job, you can still do that with your social media credentials, your information we've collected from that profile. But oh, by the way, if we are moving towards you applying for a position, and we have vetted you because now you've given us a little more data about yourself and you seem capable for that position, and we decide we're going to move forward, then we'll do more from a strong auth and a two-factor auth, and we'll onboard you a little more into our environment so that we can understand who you are as we start to move forward together. I mean, they're now finding that their user community has grown from, so in about a 2-year time, that 1,200 applicants to somewhere around 1,800 or 2,000. So more people are actually applying and becoming staffed people back onto these engagements. And that their traffic has also increased because it's less inhibitive to do business with them, or to at least get things from them. The last thing is to understand where these vendors store that data, right? Understanding how it's protected and where it's protected is key to the overall mix of, because again, if one of these middleware providers gets breached, it isn't going to be X vendor who's on the market for the exposed profile data or exposed identity data. It's going to be likely one of you who has used them as a service provider. The media is going to catch onto your name and going to bring your name forward with regards to that breach, not vendor X or Y. So on the flip side, social media's place in identity corporate to consumer. Right? So I mean, you can read through most of these. These all came from a report last year by Ballyhoo, where by and large the numbers are just meant to represent how frustrated marketing is around developing strategies for social media and unable to execute on them. But more importantly, these are all consumer numbers. 71% of social media participants say they are more likely to purchase from a brand they follow online. Like that number alone is driving organizations to say, how do I then capture that social media market so I can create loyal visitors and loyal customers? So what does that mean to corporations? They have to have a social identity. And so what we have to understand here is, first, it's about profit and risk. Damage to brand versus upside and returns. So you as an organization, is there anyone in here, I guess I'll do this question in reverse, is there anyone in here who works for a company that doesn't have a social persona? Like your company doesn't have a Facebook page or doesn't have something online that you can interact with, a Twitter account or something that presents your company. So I saw one hand. That's I would expect maybe 3 or 4 hands in an audience this large, but by and large, almost everyone has a social front end to their organization. Now, anybody here responsible for managing that social front end, just out of curiosity? Okay, so if that person was in here, they could come up and give this slide presentation for me at this point, because they would describe the struggles they're having in having multiple people use a shared account for Twitter, or having a shared account to Facebook, or having to assign access to those accounts so they can track and audit. So it comes down to damage to brand versus risk and upside and returns. I mean, I could go through, I've got 5 or 6 examples here around Netflix and them having false things posted about their subscriber count, and the SEC having to look into them in 2012. 2013, there was a corporate Twitter account for Jeep was hacked, and they announced that Chrysler was being sold to Cadillac, and so their stock prices dropped. The stock market dropped in 2013 by the tune of 6% based on tweets about an explosion at the White House from a hacked AP Twitter account. The list goes on, where there's real impacts to these social media accounts when people have a front-end persona. And so we as organizations are trying to put strategies in place around how do we have a corporate persona socially. And so there's really 3 things that matter most. There's the personal social, corporate social, and then there's the enterprise social. And the differences between those are personal social is me. I have a LinkedIn account, and so obviously I represent my company, AccuVant plus Fishnet, on LinkedIn, right? I'm an active employee there. You can see in my profile, that's where I work. So obviously anything I post on LinkedIn is meant to be posted by Robert Block, but it's also meant to be posted understanding I'm an employee of AccuVant Fishnet. My Twitter handle, RobertBlock1215, is the same thing. I use it more corporately than I ever do personally. I only took on a Twitter account because our marketing department 2 years ago decided that as thought leaders we should blog and tweet more. I don't think I would have used it personally. So I represent my organization even though they don't own my Twitter account. That would be personal social. Corporate social would be like Burger King's Twitter account, or Burger King's Facebook page, or American Airlines Twitter account, American Airlines Facebook page, right? They have human beings masked behind those pages and those accounts who post on their behalf, but do that under the persona of that corporation and not under Robert Block or Sue Smith. And so you have separate policies and strategies with regards to that. And then enterprise social, Yammer, Link, things that we all use internal to our enterprise that allow us to post to and from each other, that allow us to give each other updates, that allow us to set status, that allow us to convey information about what we're doing or where we are. There has to be policies and things put in place, even from an exposure to something that's just internal to our enterprise. Right? What are the risks relative to this? Right? So there's disclosure, discourse, conflict of interest, and outright fraud. And so just to highlight each of those for a second, right? Disclosure could be intentional and or accidental exposure of sensitive information. There's no one in here from Chick-fil-A, right? I mean, their headquarters is in Atlanta, so I'm just making sure. Right, so I was on a consulting engagement for them at one point in time, and I walked into a conference room, and literally on a whiteboard, they had their 4-year rollout plan, like for what new things were coming over the next 4 years. The changing of this bun, the changing of this ingredient for the fries, the changing of this, the changing of that. And I thought, man, if someone just took a picture of this, and again, we didn't really have a bunch of social media 5 years ago like we do today, but if someone just took a picture of this and posted it online as, hey, cool, look what my company's about to do, because there was nothing written on there like, do not expose, this is sensitive, this is private. Whoever had that meeting left it. So even if I did it inadvertently, like I wanted to brag about how cool my company was, I could be disclosing things that aren't ready for public consumption. Discourse, really meaning the publication of content that harasses others or negatively impacts the corporate image. People arguing with Burger King over their Twitter account, and then that person behind that Twitter account feeling personally frustrated enough, even though they're really representing BK, but Susan Smith just became angry enough to lash back at whoever just said how bad that burger was or how unsatisfied the Satisfies really were. Man, none of my jokes are working in here. It's terrible. Conflict of interest, right? So the use of social media to connect individuals inappropriately. And I think we see a lot of this in, is there any law enforcement here by chance? So one of the examples I didn't give, right, was in 2013, the BBC uncovered 800 police officers who had posted either racist content or used social media to friend crime victims, right? So obviously there's a conflict of interest. I encounter you in a situation where I have some authority or superiority over you in some situation, and then I use social media on the back channel to try to befriend you or make friends with you. And then fraud, right? Obviously the use of social media to obtain access to sensitive information or to purposely release inaccurate information, much like I just gave with the Jeep selling of Chrysler to Cadillac. Something that was intentionally known to not be truthful yet exposed purposely over social media. And again, those could be through insider attacks on those accounts as well as hacked accounts, right? So it's a struggle to understand how to not only protect those accounts from being hacked, but how to account for who has them and who's accessing them. And so then we get into controlling social media, right? And so there's 4 layers of social media. And if I go back to this guy here, he or she understands there's those 4 layers. They understand they have to set policy. Are they thinking about policy for all 3 of these things yet? Maybe, maybe not. They're probably only focused on the corporate social. There's education, right? How many of you have formal, just by show of hands, and I won't ask you where you work, so it's okay. How many of you have formal social media education programs today? That's great. So that number evolves every year. If I give some instance of this presentation next year, probably 3/4 of you will raise your hands. How many of you, if you know, have active monitoring of your social media accounts, meaning they're handled as privileged accounts, and there's auditing to who uses them and how they're tracked? That's good. So that number got a little smaller from education, as you just saw by show of hands. And then, just out of curiosity one more time, how many of you have a check-in, check-out process for access control to those accounts? The hands got smaller again. But that's so we're living today in the policy and education world, and we need to quickly get ourselves into the monitoring and access control world. If I ask the same set of questions around the management of privileged domain rights accounts or Unix sysadmin root accounts, the hands would go back up because we've been treating privileged accounts longer than we've been treating social media accounts. But in reality, they both have an equal amount of exposure and damage that can happen to brand. So the key takeaways from here, right? Understand your risks and how to weigh them against your investments, right? Understand your costs, direct and reputational. Inventory your amount of social media access that's out there today. So you can't possibly set policy until you've at least inventoried all of your accounts in these areas. And I mean even the personal social. So this is a Columbus company, so I won't pick on that company or that person. But I do know there's a company here that forbids you to have a social media presence relative to your corporate persona whatsoever. Right? You can't, even online, you have to give a very vague or generic description to what you do for a living. Right? They're very brand sensitive and protective to how you convey your relationship relative to them. Right? So obviously they've got a handle, at least in their minds, on personal social. And in their minds, risk, where are we at here? Sorry. Risk outweighed any upside in return to allowing you to have more freedom of expression. So they don't. But inventorying the amount of people who have access and where and how you're represented socially is important. And then ultimately building a strategy and then managing that strategy so that this poor guy here, that the number goes down every year and not up. So I said it before, identity service providers are the key to all of this on the consumer identity front, right? And we used to think we were cool in the Federation days when this was the original concept, right? We had someone who provided a service, and then we had someone who wanted that service, so they provided an identity. Usually it was a user of a given application or service that came to us from the internet over some associated set of shared protocols that we've mutually agreed to use from a B2B relationship perspective, like SAML. And we said, okay, great, we'll let you in with that native credential and you can see our stuff, or you can use our service. But the reality has obviously changed to where the service consumers are coming from a variety of places, not just a B2B type relationship, and a variety of devices and a variety of backends and a variety of certificates and a variety of mechanisms, not just SAML anymore. But fundamentally, it hasn't really changed, right? There are still identity providers and there are service providers. And so we have to find a way through specifications to allow the service providers' services to be exposed to those who are providing identity. What we need to understand, though, is that nowadays everyone's an identity provider. And almost everyone's a service provider in some extent. I mean, is there anybody in here, by show of hands again, that doesn't expose their services to some extent online in some capacity today? Right. But the identity provider explosion started about 3 years ago. I mean, I would be at conferences like Gartner and I'd get asked, like, hey, do you know about Juniper Networks SSO? And that's a very hardware device-based thing. Or do you know about McAfee's SSO? I'm like, no, I know SiteMinder. I know Oracle Access Manager, right? I know our traditional identity access management vendors. So we had a guy, I'm sure his internship was not fun, but one of the things we gave him to do over an internship with us for a quarter was to go out and try to inventory the product market around single sign-on and build us a nice little spreadsheet and a database that we could query from and be able to talk to, at least, yes, we've heard of that one before and here's what it's called. And I think he found over 356 different SSO providers or SAML-capable identity service providers in the marketplace. And so it's almost impossible to keep your hands on top of everyone who is an identity provider today. The standards are still evolving and emerging. Hybrid will likely be the long-term reality. And what I mean by that is, you know, you're going to likely accept some level of known associations through federation, and you're going to likely have some level of more open standards, OAuth-based consumer associations as well, while everything is still evolving and emerging. And of course, when everything seems to be in its most chaotic state, the government decides to try to get involved and make it even more chaotic. Make it more straightforward and clear. But if I don't have internet here, or at least I haven't attempted to log into a wireless network by the time I got up here, so I won't try to pull this up to you today. But if you just were to Google government-approved identity service providers, this website would come up, and there's, I believe, 7 or 8, maybe 9 now, listed identity service provider that the Department of Defense and the federal government has decided that those folks can assert identity on behalf for DoD civilian employees, for DoD federal contractors, and it's things like VeriSign, who I would have expected. PayPal is on there, who I would have expected. Google is on there, who I would have not expected. There are 5 or 6 others. TransUnion is on there, who I would have expected. Most of them are financial institutions. There's 2 universities, and then there's a couple of the internet-based providers like PayPal and Google. And then there's levels of assurance, right? So the government's trying to help you understand that if you as a business will allow someone to use this identity service provider, here's the level of assurance we think we can have that that identity is a vetted identity or not. And obviously someone from TransUnion is going to be a greater degree than Google. And someone who lives in that middle sphere between Google and TransUnion is probably PayPal. And so the government tries to help you understand from a level of assurance perspective how that breaks out. So because everyone's an identity service provider, there's also single sign-on everywhere. And single sign-on was dead for a lot of years. I mean, I've been in this space again for probably about 14 years, and we did a lot of internal web-based SSO 8 or 9 years ago, and then it died for a good period of years. And then as the cloud and SaaS services explosion occurred, no one wanted one more user ID and password for every third-party service this poor individual has to consume because the corporation told him to. So SSO found its rebirth with regards to SaaS and cloud services. So now most organizations look like this. And in fact, I won't take credit for this graphic. I stole it from Simplified. So if you've seen this before from a vendor, don't infer that I'm recommending them or anyone else for that matter. But I like the architectural picture in that, here's your corporate enterprise. Here's what used to be your extranet DMZ. And then there's all these different repositories, some virtualized, some not. There's Active Directories, there's this, there's that, and the other. And there's some folks trying to get to, PaaS and SaaS. There's some people trying to get to on-prem. There's some people trying to get out to pure cloud. So our SSO vendor partners need to adopt more to this new reality than to, hey, we're only going SaaS only. And so we have to understand that every vendor has a different strategy, and that the organizations all have different strategies too. The organizations I talked to today are still falling into two categories. Cloud first, really meaning they've really worked really hard to minimize that legacy footprint, if not, eradicate it altogether. And then there's the cloud second, where they still are going to have a large, long-term legacy footprint that will likely never go away. But oh, by the way, because of either decentralization in the business or because of financial demands on the business, they're adopting cloud as a go-forward strategy as well. So your SSO strategy will differ tremendously at some points in time, depending on which one of the types of organizations you are there. Is there anyone in here, I just always like to ask this, that has not adopted a cloud app corporately? This might be like the second session where I got no hands. There's usually one or two laggards who say, nope, but corporately we haven't yet, and here's why. So it's good to see that at least I think everyone is using cloud today. Different vendors, different strategies. Most of them are all 100% standards-based, and sooner or later you get to set it and forget it. But that mix of standards or somewhat proprietary-based mechanisms change. And again, I won't use vendor names, but some of them have fundamental differences. Some are agent-based, some are not agent-based. Some will replicate a copy of your known credential store out into their cloud environment so they can do password replay to get you SSO. There's a variety of differences architecturally within the product vendors. So even though SSO is everywhere, you still need to be cognizant around how SSO is occurring or how you want it to occur in your environment. And so again, we're in this world where the standards continue to evolve and frankly compete with each other. I saw this was 2 years ago at the Cloud Identity Summit, that if you've never gone to, by the way, and you have a lot of investment in cloud and identity, you should probably check out. Ping puts it in pretty good places. So that's always a byproduct benefit. But one of the sessions was SAML is dead. I thought, man, I know everyone who uses SAML. Like, how could SAML possibly be dead? So I went to that session to understand what that meant. And of course, it was hosted by OpenID, and the guy speaking was one of the directors or one of the original people who sat and developed the OAuth specification. So of course, to him, SAML's dead because he wants everyone using the things that they just created. WS is almost dead. And at the time, Microsoft and IBM thought, well, if SAML's going to be out there, we're going to create WS. And so nowadays, thank God, Microsoft is now accepting SAML and SAML 2.0, and then we're moving right along. And so I don't know a lot of folks who are using WS anymore. But nonetheless, the standards are still evolving and competing with each other. Tactical and economical method to delivery, value and risk, kickstart larger IAM programs. So I couldn't have said that 2 years ago. But now we're having customers come to us and say, listen, I know I got this big thing I want to do, this huge governance project or this huge identity management initiative, and it stinks how we manage our users today, and lots of it's still manual access requests, but you're going to scare me with this $500,000 software ticket and this $500,000 integrator number, and you know what? I got a bunch of people complaining they have too many username and passwords, and I know that's more economical for us. Can I kickstart my program by starting there? Can I get a win? Can I get some gloss and shine behind identity? And then they won't be so overburdened by this big number I'm about to bring at them. And we've seen some success behind that for organizations. Hybrid is the new norm. Expect to deploy more than one. So again, as I said, if this is your architectural view of the world, and not just this, you likely already have more than one today. You likely have deployed ADFS because it came with free as a part of your Windows Server licenses. And then you realize that having all those one-to-one relationships maybe didn't work, but it worked for its purpose initially. And then maybe you have a ping because you needed to do some workforce to SaaS. And then maybe you had SiteMinder from 5 years ago because you needed to do some workforce to web. So you now find yourself with all three, and what do? I'm not going to be one who tells you to consolidate. I'm going to tell you that hybrid reality you live in today is likely going to be your new norm going forward, even though all the vendors now provide all the services. So if you haven't bought, you may buy one and not multiples, but likely you're going to own multiples and need to be okay with that. And then ultimately, because everyone's an SSO vendor, expect to own more than one. I get into that conversation with customers a lot, right? So customers will say, well, if I have F5, which has a module called APM, and I already own it as part of my F5 license, why do I got to buy ping? And I can have that discussion because you're maybe trying to convince someone financially that they have to spend money on this technology twice. But ultimately, one is better than others in certain use cases. And so rather than getting into those justification conversations, we try to get you to understand that everything you own, and I'll show you an inventory of your environment, you likely have SSO across your environment in 2 or 3 different places today from those different hardware vendors who adopt SSO today. And so just getting used to the fact that you're going to own more than one and being comfortable with that is the today reality. So rounding out the end of consumerization, thanks. Your device, your identity. So I won't spend a lot of time here, but I think we all know that our devices are becoming more and more about us, and there's really no end to the amount of usage for this information. And so just in every one of these examples, and I'll just pull them all up here for a second. Right? I probably used most of these today, but in every one of these examples, right, in this case, my device being my phone, asserted my identity in every one of these situations. Including, and probably most importantly, this last one, right? I check email from my phone, I can get attachments from that email, and then I can do things with them on my phone. So I use my phone probably in these mobile situations where I'm not in the office more than I do my laptop. And so understanding how that impacts you as an organization. I was at a company meeting with a company, last week, and they asked me, "What's your opinion on MDM? What's your opinion on mobile device management? What's your opinion on MAM or mobile account management? Do we need one or the other? Which is more effective?" And so it spun into this whole conversation about having to have both. And why? Because nowadays, more than one or the other isn't alone good enough. The fact that you can device wipe is great, right? You can remove things from that device when that person no longer works for you. But knowing that they can download applications and knowing that almost every web instance or service is available in a cloud application today, you may want to containerize that whole experience and not just be able to remote wipe it, but also remote manage what they can do with it because they have this corporate persona on this personal device they own. Infrastructure integration increases daily. I comment a lot about how all my apps talk to each other really without my permission some days, right? My food app reminds me I just ate like crap last week, and my running app reminds me I didn't run for the last 10 days, and then they talk to each other and they both gang up on me on Sunday mornings because they see the sun is out because the weather app has told them it's nice out. So your phone almost acts against you from that federation integration perspective at that point. And the lack of privacy is scary, right? So if my mom was here, I would pick on her with regards to this generation gap. She's still a woman who writes, sorry, not a woman, but she's a woman, but she's still someone who in that age group writes a check at the grocery store and doesn't use an ATM card, right? And I'm like, "Mom, you don't own an ATM card?" She's like, "No, I like to see my bank teller. I like to write my checks. I like to balance my checkbook." She owns a smartphone, I think, because she couldn't figure out how to buy a phone without apps. But she comes to me, on a regular basis. How do I take a picture again? How do I? She texts on a pretty regular basis, but because she is going to exist for some period of time, thank God. But she's not going anywhere soon. This generation gap with regards to resistance or confusion on how to use this thing as your device is ultimately going to prolong before we all flip over to really just being completely device dependent. But there will be a time, probably not in our lives, but probably in our kids' lives, where you'll use this at the DMV, you'll use this at TSA, you'll use this, you'll use this, you'll use this, and you won't use this, which will probably be nice for my pants anyway. All right, so I am unfortunately running out of time, and I think we're just kind of ending to the end of the consumerization slides. You guys were my test sample for this new combined consumerization and then integration, and so obviously 45 minutes is not near enough time. But with any minute or so left, does anybody have questions around the consumer piece? I'll probably be at the booth where FishNet is for the next hour or so if you want to ask questions there, if you want to talk and stop by. I've recognized a number of you in the room if you want to stop by and say hello. Again, thanks for your time today. Thanks for listening to me blabble.